Hi, this is J.Roycroft submitting my journal entry number 1 for week 3. Okay, so I'm going to break the readings up in a different order than they were on Canvas just because that's how they made sense to me when I was reading them and organizing my thoughts. And the first one that I wanted to dive into was the Decolonizing Methodologies by Tawahi Smith. Apologies if I'm not saying that right. But basically, I thought that this one was especially interesting because it kind of talked about how Western views kind of shaped every single place that they colonized, like especially like indigenous perspectives. They have been super forgotten and pushed aside just because of these Western ideals, which I think is interesting because I feel like when I think of colonialization and kind of everything that follows that, obviously I think of like the systems put in place, like power hierarchies, and like we were talking about in the previous few classes about how like racial systems and other systems of separation were created by these like colonialization and Western ideals. But I didn't really think about how the ideas of these like groups and the ideas of these indigenous groups and their knowledge was actually being kind of like forgotten and pushed aside as well, which I think is super interesting because they're kind of like exploiting and marginalizing these indigenous ideas in a way that kind of fits like the Western narrative and kind of like forgets about all of that, which then kind of connects me to the second reading that I broke down, which was the bird reading. That was What I Want to Be Called, where it talks about how the indigenous groups like did not have the abilities to name themselves, and things such as like Native American, American Indian, these were names given to these people by the Western society, and oftentimes they're broad names. People think that they're interchangeable, like people don't necessarily like know like what's the difference between a Native American and a American Indian, so that kind of leads to confusion. And that kind of had me thinking of like, this isn't a super random thought, but like sometimes I have like movies that I've seen, especially like old like Western films where like Native Americans are featured, and most of the time they have like this identical look where they have like the teepee tents, they have like the feather headpieces on and stuff like that. And after reading this, they're all called the same. Like in most of these like old traditional like Hollywood Western films, these Native Americans are not called by their tribe names, they're not called by their group names, they're just called Native Americans or American Indians, which takes away the power of these groups. Because if these groups do not have the ability to name them, then they kind of lose their power and the recognition of their group. So they're kind of like their ability to name themselves is where their power comes from, and Western society is also taking away some of that power, which is also with their like methodology, when Western methodologies, apologies, are taking over society and blocking out all other like indigenous ideas, names included. They take all the power away from the people, and even in the ability of what they want to be called. And then kind of like to summarize all of those ideas, we have Decoloniality by Walsh and Mignolo, I believe. And this is just kind of like, I feel like a general way to summarize them, but it kind of talks about how obviously like the idea of like colonialism, whatever, it starts with conquest and the taking over of other people because you were more powerful. And from this, there is the legacy of colonialism and the power hierarchy set in place by Western culture, and kind of like how like with the decolonization of knowledge, this is giving us the ability to bring back these forgotten stories and bring back these forgotten ideas, which, as the other two articles that I just previously talked about discussed on, you can bring back ideas such as naming, or you can bring back forgotten stories and historical ideas. So I feel like this article is a good one to do last because it kind of brings the other two articles together, I feel like, to a T. And it talks about how like decoloniality is the critique of how Western thought has imposed on all these ideas and culture. Western thought and colonialization did not allow for all these ideas to mesh together. It only allowed for the Western ideas to just push all the other ones away and basically kind of leave them forgotten to society until now, with decoloniality and the want to decolonize knowledge and bring back these forgotten stories and forgotten names and stop the exploitation of these marginalized groups for Western benefit. And I think that's my summary. Yeah.